So let me welcome today's speaker, who you might already know, but if not, Tom Beeks is a trainer at the Bell Foundation. Tom has worked in English language education since 2003, and he's taught around the world. He's particularly interested in international education, teacher development. And within the foundation, Tom helped create our Language Results International suite of online training. And he also works as an assessor for our free accreditation scheme. And in today's webinar, Tom will provide practical guidance for creating, revising, and evaluating school language policy as a tool for developing more inclusive and effective EAR provision. As the webinar progresses, feel free to use the chat options to send any questions as they come to you. I will collate them and I will post them to Tom at the end. And in the next couple of days, you will receive an email from us with a link to the recording of this webinar, but also links to any resources that we mentioned today. So don't worry about jotting those down too much. We'll send everything in an email afterwards. But now it's time to pass over to Tom. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, and big welcome to everyone. Great to see so many people here from across the world. And just a reminder that I love it if people add comments or questions throughout in the chat throughout the webinar as it occurs to you. Please feel free to do that. And also just a reminder that with this webinar, I think it defaults to sending the messages to the host and panelists. But if you want everyone to see it, I think you have to press the little blue drop-down menu so that everyone can see it, because it's often really nice to get people sharing ideas as we go along. So the reason we're here today is to explore in a bit more depth the idea of creating an inclusive language policy. So we're going to look at why that might be important, the kinds of things it could include, 4 dimensions of inclusion that we could apply when creating a language policy, and also how we might evaluate the levels of inclusion within an existing school language policy. And that's so that hopefully as a professional working in a multilingual environment, you feel more confident, perhaps writing, creating, or just updating and reviewing your school language policy. And ultimately so that the plurilingual learners and staff in your school can feel welcomed, valued, and included in the school environment and achieve their full potential. So I wanted to begin just with a quick definition of terms. So I imagine that if you've signed up for this webinar, you're well aware of what a language policy is. But just in case, language policies typically set out the principles, practices for multilingual provision and the role of languages in the school and classroom. And in some schools, that policy may be subsumed within other policies, such as a teaching and learning policy or literacy and communications policy. Other schools might include language in their equality policy and so on. But certainly on the whole, I see it's very typical for international schools to have language policies. And I think that's because, there is now this strong recognition that the approach to dealing with the spectrum of languages and language varieties spoken within international schools really needs to be intentional and strategic, because it's such an integral part of school life, and it can't really just be sidelined and kind of, left to happen on its own. So I'd like us just to think about our own contexts for a moment. And just get a sense of where everyone in the attending is kind of coming from. So if you're happy to share your thoughts, you can type those in the chat. But if you'd rather not, you can just keep it in your head. And my first question for you is simply, does your school have a language policy? And if the answer is no, don't worry, that's not necessarily a problem, because you may have other policies or documents or procedures that fulfill that role. but certainly if you are, I think if you're working in a school where there's a really substantial population of plurilingual learners, it could be something that's very useful. Someone said, not that I think is useful. Okay. Hopefully this webinar will give you some guidance. Okay. Interesting. So our next question is, do you know who wrote it? And who is the intended audience for this document? No, someone's written, they've been tasked for writing with writing it. And again, these are just things to sort of make you think about, well, what is actually the purpose of having this document? And it kind of leads on to my third question, which is the policy read and known by school staff? So what I'm speaking to there is, is it a living document? Where does it live? Where can people find it? Does it get changed, updated, referred to, manipulated? Or, is it written in parchment and sitting covered in dust somewhere in the school basement? And the reason for these questions isn't to sort of make you feel bad about what your school is doing or anything like that, but it's to start with the idea that a language policy shouldn't exist for its own sake. Okay, so for it to be useful, it needs to be a purposeful and living document that is known and referred to and updated and worked with. And our purpose today then is to explore how we might create a policy like that is both useful to and inclusive of our plurilingual students and staff. Okay. Some really interesting thoughts. So some people are talking about, yeah, updated when there are issues. That's interesting. So often it's kind of quite reactive process, perhaps. And people are asked to read it. I mean, yeah, look, nobody loves reading policy documents, do they? So it is always an interesting challenge of like, what is the purpose of this document? Okay, yeah, and some people say usually vibrant when there is an accreditation. So they, yeah, okay, so as soon as the accreditation, the assessors come along, yeah, everyone has to read the documents. Okay, it's great to hear your ideas. So let's just start then by, this is our agenda for today, and we're going to look at, first of all, why it might be important to have a language policy before we get into the meatier topics. And I can think of three main reasons, although there'll be lots of others, I'm sure. And the first of those would be that it simply provides a nice framework and a platform for inclusive practice. And if we think about what we mean by inclusivity, it's quite a nebulous term, isn't it? And but I think in terms of EAL provision, it's useful to compare it with other possible practices. So one of those might be segregation, where our EAL or plurilingual learners are taught separately to our first language English or fully proficient learners. Another approach might be integration, where the EAL learners are placed in mainstream classes, but they aren't provided with any extra support or accommodation. So it's kind of sink or swim. And inclusion, as we think about it at the moment, I think would look more like EAL learners being provided the support that they need to access curricular learning to the same degree as their peers who are proficient in English. Now, when we talk about inclusion, these three practices are, quite artificial constructs, because the reality is that schools that I see often use a mix and a blend of these kind of techniques. So inclusion may require, some kind of segregated support and withdrawal support in some cases. And so it's not like a black and white thing, but by having an inclusive language policy, we have that framework and a guide towards an inclusive approach. Secondly, I think it's important that a policy can meet the needs of both plurilingual pupils and staff, and the pupils' families potentially as well. And that's because these learners may have their own specific needs that are slightly different to those of those students who already speak English proficiently. Of course, a lot of those needs may be the same. So again, there probably needs to be some kind of a assessment of what are those sort of specific needs and what are the wider needs that perhaps inclusive of everyone across the school in terms of which ones belong in your language policy. And thirdly, I think it really helps school take that kind of long-term strategic and whole school approach to EAL provision or multilingual provision. So if we think about what is meant by inclusion and integration again, I actually looked up a paper by the OECD that talks about integration and describes it as a two-way process. And they're talking about it at the societal level, okay? So the sort of national level. And they describe it as integration as a two-way process that requires adaptation by migrants, but also by the receiving society. So it's not just on one group. It's a two-way process. And I think this is a really useful idea that we can repurpose in an education context. So we can think of it as integration and inclusion policies need to be targeted at the whole school, in addition to our plurilingual students as well. And a whole school language policy, I think, is a really good way of helping to embed that whole school approach. So let's get into what that might actually look like. And I'm going to introduce you to these 4 dimensions of inclusion. And these are taken from a book that I would highly recommend called Language Development and Social Integration of Students with English as an Additional Language. This was a book by a set of academics from the University of Cambridge and also Anglia Ruskin here in Cambridge and Durham University. So it was based for a UK audience, but one of the chapters in there proposes a model of inclusive pedagogy for EAL, and it includes 4 dimensions. So the first of those is academic inclusion. So this is all about ensuring that plurilingual learners are fully included in curricular learning activities. It includes things like resources, bilingual support, pedagogy assessment, and so on. This is probably the thing that we're most familiar with as EAL professionals in terms of when we think about EAL provision. Secondly is linguistic inclusion, which is ensuring that plurilingual learners' whole language repertoires are used to support learning. That all languages and language varieties a child speaks are valued. So again, that's going to speak to things like home language development and translanguaging and so on. The third dimension is social inclusion. So this is ensuring that our plurilingual learners and their families feel accepted, comfortable, safe, and can build positive relationships with their peers and staff and feel part of the school community and the local community. And lastly, and underpinning all the rest, is teachers' inclusive attitudes. And this means ensuring that teaching staff and potentially leaders as well, and everyone who works in the school environment, that they're holding attitudes that position plurilingual learners as assets, that they value the benefits of multilingualism, and that there is a delabeling of plurilingual learners. So what I mean by delabeling is the idea of not pigeonholing our plurilingual learners, not mentally grouping them all together, viewing the challenges that they face as variations of the challenges faced by all learners who are going through schooling. And I think this one is probably the hardest to address because, as we know, changing people's attitudes can be really difficult. But I think it's also the most important, probably. If you are interested in exploring those in more depth, we did a webinar last year about that, and I direct you towards that. It should be on our YouTube channel. And also it's on chapter 6 of this book if you want to read in more detail. And I will provide the references for that afterwards, and we'll send those to you as well at the end in the email we send out after the webinar. So, what should a language policy include, and how can we ensure that it's addressing each of those dimensions? Well, we'll start by just maybe, I'll throw it over to you. I'd like to hear your ideas, first of all. What kind of areas could you include in a language policy? So you don't, you can be quite broad or you can be specific. I don't mind, like whatever idea springs to your mind, based either on your own experience or things that you've done in the past or your own school's policy. Okay, so we've got instructional language, language of instructions. What is language provision, home language, a rationale, language pathways, strategies to allow the use of other languages. Okay. Implementation, that's a big word, useful. Additional languages, principles, guiding principles, rights of learners. Interesting. Okay. Importance. Okay. Just to remember, if you want other people to see your comments, please change the blue tab in your in the comments bar to everyone and not just hosts and panelists. Otherwise, nobody else is seeing your ideas and your contributions. Yeah, some really interesting ideas coming up there. Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Well, it's great to hear what other people are thinking and how it works in reality, practice. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to just spam you, if you like, with a long list of possible areas, many of which have already been mentioned by people in the chat. But here are some possible areas you may want to include. I'll give you a moment just to sort of read that. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. It's also not meant to be like a contents page for your next policy. It's simply about highlighting some areas that might be useful. But the areas that you include in your school will always be contingent on your own context and your own needs as a school, and the depth and the scope of your document, because everybody's working in slightly different ways. So what I'd like to do is just explore each area on this list in a bit more depth. And as I say, there's loads of great ideas already come up in the chat. So if you do have anything to add or that you think isn't being mentioned, please do feel free to add that. This is not meant to be by any means everything. It's just some areas that I thought might be important. So I'll start with this idea of vision and context. So this might include having a clear mission statement, which is outlining your school's ethos towards multilingualism. And obviously that relates directly to the point we made earlier about the importance of valuing plurilingual students, which I mentioned when talking about inclusive attitudes. It really starts from the top, and I do think it's important to have a really strong, kind of clear statement about that. It could include your school's vision for its plurilingual learners and its expected goals for them. So, having those high expectations and setting them out, what the learners can expect in their experience at the school. And it may also include more specific information about the context. So I'm talking about things like the socio-cultural or societal context in which the school operates in relation to the languages spoken by its staff, students, and within the wider community. So, which are the main languages spoken in the surrounding community or country, and how does that relate to the languages spoken in the school and the school staff and things like that. It may also include legal specifications from the country in which you're operating regarding access to education for students of different linguistic backgrounds. So this could also link a lot to that idea of linguistic inclusion. And also other countries they will have controls on the languages that are being taught in terms of maintaining home languages for local students and things like that. So there may be constraints or legal requirements that can be mentioned as well. And lastly, I think you might want to think about a rationale or even a glossary that sets out the specific terminology that is used within your school for talking about multilingualism and your plurilingual learners. So, some schools might use the term EAL learner. Other schools might prefer things like English language learner. Schools have their own ways of talking about it, but I think it's usually useful to have a kind of clear rationale that sets out which terms you're using, what you mean by those terms, so that there's that clarity. And yeah, then obviously that again will be specific to your school and your context. The second area would be talking about language teaching and learning. So this includes things like multilingual support on offer at the school, such as the use of bilingual teaching assistants or staff, translation tools you have available, multilingual resources. People mentioned this already in the chat, I noticed, but you might want to talk about pedagogy. So what are the techniques and strategies that you expect teachers to use to facilitate language development alongside curricular learning? And what are they using? Well, how are they helping learners to access that curricular learning? And as a side note, if you're going to do that, ask yourself how many of these pedagogies are useful for all of your learners and not just your plurilingual learners. And if the answer is most of them, then perhaps this is something that belongs more properly in a kind of whole school learning and teaching policy or something like that. If we're really, if we really want to make take an inclusive approach to teaching and learning, then ideally we're using techniques that don't just benefit our plurilingual learners, but are of benefit for all our learners. But of course, there might be specific techniques that we want to exploit with our plurilingual learners. And I think home language use is one of those, and that's something that came up. So that would definitely be something to talk about. How are home languages used for learning? Are staff provided with the flexibility and the freedom to exploit the language repertoires for different purposes to enhance learning? And how is that achieved? And I think this is where we have to be really cautious to avoid things like language policing. So things like blanket English only rules without any rationale. This is something that will allow you to steer clear of that and make sure that things like English only prescriptions are only being applied in very particular context where it's appropriate and where it's agreed by the teachers and the staff to be the most teachers and the students to be the most beneficial thing for them. I think it might also be useful to think about what is the role of teaching staff? What are the expectations of the teaching staff in your school? And what are their roles in relation to supporting your plurilingual learners? So what are you expecting of your class and subject teachers? What are you expecting of your TAs? Are they in the classroom purely for language support, or are they there for other things as well? If you are using EAL specialists as in-class support, what is it that they are expected to do? Are you just plonking them in the classroom and saying, great, oh, how are they meant to intervene to support those learners? And likewise, if you're using team teaching, how is that enacted in your setting? So what is the processes? And again, breaking down what that means can be very helpful. So essentially, I think this is kind of moving beyond sort of platitudes like all teachers are language teachers, which is an important thing in an international context, but it's going beyond that and outlining what that actually looks like, or you want it to look like in your school. Okay. So assessment and record keeping is something else that's critical, isn't it, in when we're working with our plurilingual learners. So you might want to mention what tools you're using for assessing your multilingual learners. And so are you using tools for EAL specifically, or are you using tools for particular home languages if appropriate? And are the methods that you're using fair and equitable? So you know, are you using tools designed for first language speakers of English to assess plurilingual learners? And if you are, then what's your rationale, or what support or what accommodations are you offering to ensure that that's fair? Yeah, Deirdre, that's a good question. She's just queried why use plurilingual or not multilingual. The reason we use plurilingual is I use plurilingual for the individual child, and I would use multilingual more broadly, perhaps. The difference from the Council of Europe, yeah, Alexander's just pointed that out. The difference plurilingual just comes from the European framework, and what they mean by plurilingual is this idea that people have multiple languages and they use them and they mix them together, and you know, it's that messy, beautiful kind of multilingual experience that we see in schools. Whereas multilingualism, the theory is that multilingualism is a little bit more of I guess a traditional view, which is languages are these separate entities, and we can talk about bilingual, plurilingual, we can talk about bilingual and multilingual, and you know, they're very distinct, and there's not that element of mixing and that messiness, and that's kind of but it's quite an abstract difference, to be honest. So personally, I think it's fine to use them interchangeably in most situations, because most people will understand them as kind of being the same thing. But there might be some situations, such as your language policy, where you want to be really, really intentional and specific about your terminology, where you might want to consider it as a difference. Anyway, back to assessment. So we talked about assessment tools, also your assessment procedures. Again, both admissions and formative and summative assessment. What kind of accommodations are provided for formal assessments for your plurilingual learners? And then are there clear benchmarks for the amount of support that learners are receiving at different stages of proficiency? And what is your rationale for those benchmarks? And is there a clear rationale for the provision of any withdrawal support in place of mainstream inclusion, for example? So like, what lessons will students miss perhaps to get that intensive support? And how is that decided? And lastly, you know, again, it's quite, it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's quite important. How is information recorded, kept, and shared? And where can it be found? Or how do people access it? Because again, it's one thing collating all this amazing information, but there's not really any point in collating it if nobody ever looks at it or knows where it is. And another quite important point, and I think this is something that is quite a tricky subject potentially to think about in terms of a language policy, but it's where does special educational needs fit in your EAL provision? And what I mean by that is, first of all, how is special educational needs support organized and ensured for your plurilingual pupils? And also, how are special educational needs and EAL needs evaluated and distinguished? So I think it's really important to make it clear that EAL is not a learning difficulty, for example. It's not specifically a special educational need. And certainly if you're working in a school that has perhaps inherited its learning and teaching framework from a national system, like in the UK or in the United States, it has been the case in the past that EAL is seen as sort of under the umbrella of special educational needs, whereas, you know, as certainly in an international school context, I think we would view it more as just, different languages are just part and parcel of variation that makes all students different. It's not necessarily, a special educational need in the same way that certain learning disabilities would be. So again, in terms of a policy, that means if you want an inclusive policy, I think that needs to be very clearly stated, especially if that's something that staff in your school have a difficulty with kind of separating in their minds. And that might manifest itself in things like the use of language as well. So you might want to comment on the language that gets used in your school. So, for example, I often hear people using terms like severe EAL or very EAL. So this is language that's kind of unconsciously, I think, sort of medicalizing the fact that children don't have proficient English. So I mean, it's not meant in any kind of, it's never meant by the people using it in a malicious way, but I think subconsciously it can happen quite easily when there's not that clear distinction between what special educational needs and EAL needs are. It's a really it is a really tricky issue to distinguish between, for example, linguistic problems that might be due to special educational needs and that are due to simply language acquisition, second language acquisition processes. So again, this isn't the time to discuss that now. If you do want to find out more, we did publish a couple of months back a guidance document on our website for free. It's like it's like 200 odd pages long, I think, and there's a lot of information on that. So please seek that out if that is an area that interests you. And lastly, we can talk about special educational needs, but we also need to think about what about students who we might term gifted or who've got special talents. How are they properly challenged and guided to fulfill their potential, regardless of their language proficiency? So again, it's maybe just making it clear that you have the same high expectations and they have the same opportunities to excel as their proficient English peers. Okay. Another area, these are actually two distinct areas, but I've put them together for the sake of convenience. And that is, how are we bringing a language lens to the planning process of the curriculum? How are language objectives being included in that planning process? So, it's language and content integration essentially. And we've already, I think I heard people mention that might be things like just talking about collaboration. How does collaborative planning work in your school? Or, are EAL specialists and subject teachers or classroom teachers, given the chance to plan together? It might include things like the inclusion of language objectives in scheme of work templates or in planning pro formas. So it might be to do with how your paperwork templates are structured. And more broadly, we want to think about how is EAL provision getting monitored and evaluated? How do you know what's happening in your classrooms? So this might be things like, are EAL lessons being observed and evaluated, or are mainstream lesson observations being done with an EAL lens? For example, are there, included in lesson observation rubrics or descriptors, does it mention things like language support pedagogy, strategies, and techniques? And also you might want to mention who is responsible for that evaluation, who does that in your school, and how does that process work? Resources, I mean, I think this is fairly self-explanatory, but you might want to mention the kind of expected resources that are made available to support plurilingual students. Obviously, we have a lot of amazing technological tools that are available to us at the moment for doing things like that. It also might be interested to provide some guidance and information about what are the criteria for selecting and reviewing and evaluating the purchase of new resources. So, what kind of criteria are you looking at when you're particularly buying things like books and textbooks, I think, to make sure that they are inclusive for your plurilingual student. So that might mean making sure they're culturally appropriate. It might mean, can you find source books in the languages of those learners, especially if you're in a sort of bilingual context. So it could include things like that. And you might also want to talk about any budget that's allocated for EAL multilingual resources if you're very lucky. And I think another area that could come into the remit of resources is the use of technology. And obviously, this is a really big question right now with the rise of generative AI software. So, how is technology expected to be used in your school to support plurilingual pupils? So I guess this might include things like policies on smartphone use or the use of translation software. And obviously the big one at the moment, AI, which I'm not going to get into at the moment, but that is certainly something that's on everyone's radar. How do we expect AI to be used by our students and our staff to enhance learning? Okay. Staffing structure and staff development as well could be something I think is really important to have in a language policy. So which staff members have responsibility for EAL provision in your school? Again, it's surprising how often I talk to schools and it's not actually very clear, or it's one person and they're just doing everything. So, this is perhaps a way of trying to think about it a little bit more strategically. So even if you do have, you're a small school and you only have one EAL specialist or you're one EAL coordinator, who is that person speaking to? Who is there someone in the senior leadership team who is named as being responsible for multilingual or EAL provision in your school? Who do your staff go to if they have a concern about a EAL student related to their language acquisition, and they need help? Who does that person go to in your school? It's also going to be really important to think about recruitment, potentially. Again, this is perhaps a question more for school leadership, but we want them to encourage them to think about what kind of expertise do they expect their EAL staff to have. And again, this is where I think we need to be really careful about the use of language, because you will quite often, I think, hear kind of terminology that is not inclusive, that contains kind of hidden assumptions or hidden prejudices. So I can think about, for example, using terminology like and using nationalities as another word for suggesting like proficiency in English, or saying like local staff to mean staff who are fluent in the local language. Okay, and sort of kind of making lots of assumptions without actually explicitly saying what it is you mean. So, I mean, the classic one, of course, I hope most schools don't do anymore, but it's using terms like native English speaker, when actually what you mean is somebody with proficiency and expertise in English, which has got nothing really to do with what your first language is. But anyway, that's that is something to wrestle with in these kind of documents, I think, and to clarify. So we mentioned qualifications would be important. You want again, EAL, unfortunately EAL support is sometimes seen as a bit of a kind of secondary priority. And schools are not as rigorous about recruiting in terms of the kind of qualifications they expect as they might be for other positions. So again, being really clear about what you expect and what kind of expertise you expect. And lastly, and probably, really most importantly, is that idea of CPD and what you're doing to train your teachers to ensure that they are able to support your plurilingual learners. So again, this takes me back to a quote by Constant Leung and Kreis in their book about EAL provision, and they talk about inclusive pedagogies, unless properly resourced with appropriate teacher expertise and knowledge, will fail the very students they set out to support. So CPD is continuous professional development. That's teacher training, basically a teacher development that's happening on the job usually. Yeah, to clarify terms. So I should have clarified. And staff development can also look like providing language lessons for teaching staff who don't speak the local language. You might also look at the role of parents in the wider community. What is the role of the school? What is the school's role in the wider community? How does that relate to your plurilingual pupils? What role do parents play in achieving the goals of the language policy? You know, how are they involved and brought into school life? I see schools doing great things with things like having parent groups for particular languages and things like that to kind of make sure that there is that sort of that social inclusion when families arrive from other countries, for example. And finally, that communication. How do schools communicate with their multilingual families, and what are the key messages that they're trying to convey to those families? So again, if we can be clear about our approach to languages and multilingualism to the parents, they're going to be much more supportive and on board with what we're trying to do. And this links in, doesn't it, as well, to procedures around admissions and transitions. This is often a difficult time for all of our pupils, but for plurilingual pupils, potentially even more so. So again, thinking about what happens during induction, especially for students who arrive perhaps mid-year, in the middle of the school year, if you're a school that's accepting people at lots of different times. Having kind of benchmarks clarified about what kind of support children will get, as we mentioned in the assessment part as well. And thinking about as well that difficult move from primary to secondary. A lot of international schools cover both phases, and it's a particularly tricky thing to move from one to the other. So what does that mean for your plurilingual pupils, and how can that be scaffolded and supported? And lastly, and this was kind of something I added as a little bit of an afterthought, because it's not actually something I've ever seen in a language policy. However, I attended recently a webinar that was talking about addressing unconscious bias around inclusion. And the presenter, who was an international school educator, made the point that inclusion is change. Okay. And I thought that was quite a powerful statement. Inclusion is change. And people really don't like change, generally speaking, right? And certainly my experience of implementing change in schools is that it can sometimes be the source of conflict. So maybe you want to think about, well, how does that get managed? And I don't know if the policy needs to include something like that, but certainly it's an interesting thing to think about, I think, as a school, is like, well, how are we going to manage conflict that might arise out of addressing issues related to language diversity or discrimination? Could we have any procedures around that? And what might be the support mechanisms for that? So, you know, if a staff member or student is experiencing a problem, who is available to listen to them? And how are we raising awareness with our staff and students around what a linguistically inclusive environment looks and sounds like, so that they can recognize when it isn't happening, and then we can address that. So again, this is about this idea, I think, of setting a culture where staff and pupils feel able to openly discuss these kind of issues in a sort of constructive way, rather than in a kind of defensive or kind of accusatory way. You know, trying to avoid that kind of fear that people get of saying the wrong thing or offending someone. So I think, you know, a school that can have those discussions is going to be quite successful, hopefully, in implementing more change more broadly. Anyway, so it's about having that kind of clearly defined mechanism for accountability, which makes people feel kind of safe. All right, to summarize then, I appreciate there's a lot of information there. If we go back to our different dimensions of inclusion, in terms of academic inclusion, we're probably looking at these kinds of relevant policy content in terms of it making it inclusive. So again, I'm not going to rehash what I've just said to you, but these are the areas you may want to include to address that aspect. For linguistic inclusion, we're looking at things like, you know, linguistic profile, home language use and assessment, home language development, and support perhaps for teachers and families, as well as pupils, in acquiring languages that are used in the school. Social inclusion, we'll look at things like the role in the community, things like arrivals and transition procedures, cultural exploration, and perhaps within the context of the curriculum, or in terms of extracurricular extracurricular activities, and how pupils and families are involved in school life. And for teachers' inclusive attitudes, again, this is something that's hard to address. It may not be like individual parts of your policy are going to specifically refer to this, but it's more about building a culture. So certainly your mission statement and vision will be important, but things like the use of terminology and being very intentional with the use of language, the training and awareness raising that you do with your staff, and things like the kind of staff that you recruit and things like that are going to all feed into that. Okay, so for the final section, I want to think about how we might go about evaluating a language policy. So let's imagine that we've, created our beautiful, new, shiny language policy that's a living document. But maybe a year or two's gone past and we want to think about how we might address that and go about thinking about how it still fits our needs. And here are some potential places you might want to start, things that I've seen schools do in the past. So I've seen some schools very successfully work with a kind of EAL leadership team or EAL working group with relevant staff. They could sit down and discuss the policy. This is where bringing in, I think, different voices from around the school is important. So surveying your staff, what are their attitudes to plurilingual language, plurilingual learners? How do they feel about having those learners in their classroom? How comfortable and confident are they with using the kind of strategies and techniques that you would like to see them using, things like that. Student voices are going to be extremely important as well, I think, especially if we're really serious about this being inclusive. And again, I have seen schools do really great things by having like student working groups, kind of class representatives or multilingual representatives who are kind of tasked with talking to their peers and then bringing their ideas and voices to the school leadership. This is where things like language rights as well play a role. So, what are the language rights that you want to uphold in your school? And lastly, schools obviously regularly undergo accreditations, and this is often a good opportunity, isn't it? It's where you dust off the old policies and you you print them out and you make sure everyone's read them, as was mentioned earlier. Yeah, this obviously is a good opportunity as well to think about evaluating your language policy. So, going back to accreditation, certainly most of the whole school accreditation processes that I've seen don't tend to focus very much specifically on multilingual provision and things like the language policy. It's not something they necessarily stipulate a school has, for example. But I would draw your attention to the Bell Foundation's accreditation, which is specifically for EAL provision. It's called Accreditation by Language for Results International, ALFRI. And our handbook, for example, has one of the dimensions of the accreditation is the language policy. And so the 4 categories that schools can be classified as are shown on the screen. So if you want to be implementing or exemplary, which is what you need to achieve accreditation, then your school policy needs to be known and understood by the whole school community, and it is operationalized. So it is being implemented. So again, these might just be, it's just an idea of you to think about where you are at the moment. We asked that question at the beginning, and it gives you an idea of where you are at the moment and where you might want to be in the future. But that was talking more broadly about having a language policy. But if we really want to get down and look in more depth about and explore how inclusive the policy is in terms of it meeting the needs of your students, I want to share with you a framework that I put together. And I was preparing a workshop on this topic for a conference earlier this year. So I was like, well, I felt like there was just nothing out there that really pointed people in the right direction of what to do with their policy and how they might go about updating it. So I created my own version, basically, which is something I would encourage you potentially to do for your own school as well. It's to sit down and ask yourself a list of questions that you want to be able to answer. And so the framework that I created has got 4 stages. So I thought about it in terms of it meeting the needs of the school community. So stage 1 would be, okay, this area of the policy is not meeting the needs at all. It's either not mentioned, it's absent, or it's not, it's not useful, it's not happening. Maybe it's partially meeting the needs, but there needs to be some development. Stage 3 would be mostly meeting the needs, but again, there's, we might want to make some tweaks, or there's some things that aren't being mentioned. And finally, stage 4 would be effectively meeting the needs of the whole school community in a way that we're really happy with. And what I've done is we created a set of descriptors, basically a set of questions. It's kind of like a can-do statement, but for a language policy. So, and for each dimension, there was a separate list of descriptors. So just to give you a flavor, because I won't go through all this now, I will share this document with you in the email that we're going to send out to everyone at the end. So don't worry too much about scribbling down everything that I'm saying. This is still just a working document, so it's kind of, I guess it's in its kind of beta form. So I'm very, if you have any suggestions, or if you can think of any ways to improve it, please let me know. So anyway, the first dimension is teachers' inclusive attitudes. We've put first because this is I think the one that underpins all the rest. And essentially, it's asking, does the policy contribute towards delabeling and valuing plurilingual learners? And it breaks that down into lots of little questions. For example, does the language and framing used in the policy take an additive approach to multilingualism? Just something we've already talked about. Dimension 2 is the academic inclusion. So does the policy set out how classroom pedagogy brings plurilingual learners into the center of learning and engages them in the curriculum? So something like, does the policy indicate which approaches and strategies are expected to be used across the school to scaffold the learning process without diluting the complexity of the content being taught? So, with those high expectations, we're not dumbing it down, we're just providing those scaffolds and those supports to help them access. The linguistic inclusion section talks about how do school staff exploit students' entire linguistic repertoires to support and maximize learning. So again, this is where translanguaging often comes in, if that's a term that you like to use in your school. I mentioned this earlier, but this is also things like avoiding what I would call language policing. So that's the proscription or prescription of specific language or language varieties in specific places or at specific times without any clear justification. So I'm not saying it's not always inappropriate to have a sort of English only policy or rule in a particular setting or context, but it needs to have a very clear rationale. Like, you're in an English language lesson for developing a child's speaking skills, and it's appropriate to do that. But again, I think I would definitely be avoiding anything that's kind of blanket and context independent. And finally, the social inclusion. So how does the school ensure that plurilingual learners have a sense of belonging and are fully accepted into school life? And this is certainly something that I generally see international schools as being very good at. It's usually a real strength, but again, it's looking at things like, does the policy outline how the school uses its pupils and their families to facilitate integration for plurilingual learners? So it might be things like if your school has a buddy scheme where students who share a language are placed together with a student who's been at the school for a little while buddies up with a student who's new to the school with the same language to kind of help get them through those early stages of settling in. So as I say, for each of those dimensions, I created some question prompts for you to think about the inclusivity of your language policy. And so then the idea is you could sort of fill it in as a checklist, tick if you think it's happening, cross if maybe it's not happening, question mark if you're somewhere in the middle. And, maybe then you can give yourself an overall grade as to where you are. And I just want to make the point that this is not meant to be a guide to best practice. This is not what you it's not that you should be implementing all of these things, because I think that would probably be impossible. It's just a tool for reflection and a starting point for guiding future action. And as I've said before, the scope and the level of detail for each policy will be different. So it may not be, the language policy may not actually be the place where some of this stuff belongs in your school, and that's absolutely fine. So it may be more useful to use that to analyze other documents or other things within your school, rather than just your policy. Okay, so I'll just finish off by thinking about next steps. So, if you are in charge of your school's language policy, I would like, ask yourself what happens next, what needs to happen next in terms of getting this off the ground or making it happen. Who do you need to involve, and whose buy-in is needed? Do you need to get on board someone from leadership? Do you need help? Who are your allies at the school, and maybe who do you need to convince? What might be the things you could do that are quick wins? Are there some changes that you could just make really quickly and easily? And then what might be the sort of longer term goals in terms of what you want to address? And I'd just like to leave you with a final thought, which is that a policy is just a means to an end. Having a policy is one thing, but what it says and the attitudes and the ethos it expresses are going to be hugely important. And as I've mentioned, having a policy could actually be more damaging than not having one if it's not carefully considered, and if it's not taking the needs and the experiences of our plurilingual learners and their families and the communities that the school exists in into account. And I want to leave you with an idea I recently heard in a webinar by an educator called Yasmin Hashmi, who works in an international school in Switzerland. And she made the point, I think I mentioned this earlier, inclusivity is about change. And that means an inclusive language policy is a force for change. Definitions and ideas around inclusivity are changing, and what's considered inclusive now is going to be different from what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, so on. So it's about ensuring how your policy is a living document that gets updated according to the context, according to the time in which your school is operating, and thinking about what kind of groundwork you might need to lay to facilitate that change. So a policy is a means to an end, and it's only effective if it actually leads to change. So hopefully this webinar has given you some ideas for how you might achieve that. With that, I'll throw you back to Sharka. I don't know if there's any questions that came in. If we've got any time. I think we're almost finished.
Well, thanks so much, Tom. I found that really fascinating. I think you managed to answer all of the questions as you were going through the presentation. But if there are any other questions, please do put them in the chat. As Tom said, we will be sharing a recording of the webinar with all the resources and the link to the framework that Tom's just mentioned in the email that we'll be sending out to you in the next couple of days. So please keep an eye out for those. And well, before I say goodbye, I also wanted to make you aware that we've got a course that is suitable for anyone leading on EAL assessment in your school coming up on the 29th of May, leading on EAL assessment. And we've also just published our schedule of online courses for the next school year. So you can find all the information on our website. And you can, if you're interested in online training, you can start making plans for yourself or your school staff. So thank you very much for attending today. Keep an eye out for the follow-up email, and